Hello everyone, good evening. Thank you for waiting till 6 p.m. to do some learning. Today we have Joshua Fein-Brown with us, and he's an osteopath, naturopath, and pain specialist. And he's going to be talking to us today about reintegrating the body for those in pain. So please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Hi everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces and lots of new faces as well. Can you hear me? Right back there. Yes, good. So I'm Josh. I graduated from BCom in 2015, and since I graduated, I've done another master's in pain management at UCL. And I've been very interested in pain for, well, since I was studying, really. I remember in the second year of me studying, I came across A.R. Lederman's paper, The Fall of the Structural Biomechanical Model. Has anybody come across that paper at all? I highly recommend it if you want to have a crisis about what you're doing, because it states that the structural model that I was being taught at the time, when we look at the research on how the techniques that influence the structure, like mobilizations, HVTs, soft tissue techniques, massage, how these techniques have a very good but very short-term effect. So you can make short-term changes to people's bodies, but these things don't last long-term, and they don't really change the structure at all. So I had a bit of a moment where I was going, well, what the hell are we doing then? Like, what am I doing? And why is it that when I'm in clinic treating patients, I see really beneficial results with the techniques that supposedly don't have beneficial effects, according to the research? Because there was a huge discrepancy between the two, and I'm sure you've noticed this in clinic, that your patients do get better, right? And they have really reported very beneficial effects from what you're doing. So I'm glad that this crisis happened to me in my second year, because it's taken me about 8 or 9 years to finally get around to explaining to myself what it is that really is making long-term change for patients. And it's drastically changed my practice. So the first thing that I looked at was placebo, because I thought, well, if the structure and the things that we're doing with our hands are not the main thing that's having the effect, perhaps the effect is something like the mind. And when I looked into the placebo research, what I found was actually this discrepancy that we have, this dichotomy between body and mind, that's implicit within the culture that we exist in here, and most of the Western culture, as far as I understand it, is that there is this separation. We go to a psychologist for mental health disease. We go to a doctor for our physical health problems. But the whole gold standard of research, the double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trial, is designed specifically to mitigate this extremely potent effect of mental processes on physical symptoms, the placebo effect, right? It's trying to decide, okay, what is an actual drug effect versus what is this thing that is not really an effect that we want to try and mitigate for, this placebo. And what I learned from the placebo research was that the placebo is most effective for things like pain. Pain is one of the things that is alleviated most by placebos, and that the placebo effect changes people's physiology. When you give somebody a placebo painkiller, one particularly interesting study that sticks in my mind, I'm not sure why, but they were trying to replicate irritable bowel syndrome pain. So they got a group of participants, some with IBS, some without IBS. They shoved a balloon up their arse and inflated it until it caused stretching of the colon. And that stretching activated the nociceptors and triggered similar kind of pain to IBS. In one group, they gave a painkiller, naloxone, which is the same painkiller you get in the dentist when you're having your teeth numbed. In the other group, they gave a placebo, telling them it was naloxone. The other group, they just gave nothing. Now, what they noticed was that the people who had the placebo, there was actually one more group. So there was the pain medication, being told it was pain medication. Placebo group, being told it was pain medication. Control group, and a group that was given a pain medication but told it was placebo. Now, there was no difference between the group that was actually receiving the drug and was told it was placebo, and the group that was receiving a placebo but told it was the drug. So, and this is a drug that literally shuts off the sodium channels in your nerves, so your nerves no longer function. And they noticed that if they injected people with naloxone, which is a drug that they use to, sorry, it was lidocaine, the medication. Naloxone is what they use to try and understand why this placebo effect was working. Now, if somebody is overdosing on heroin, they inject naloxone into their veins to get rid of the opiates that are stopping them from being able to breathe. Naloxone blocks opiates within the system. And it also blocks the placebo effect of analgesia. So what this means is that the placebo effect is releasing opiates in the brain, and it is releasing them in a potent way that dramatically relieves people's pain. So the placebo effect is not an inert effect, it is a real biological change. And you can even condition the immune system via the placebo effect. So once I recognize this, okay, so maybe what we're doing is influencing people's perceptions, influencing people's mental processes, and these mental processes are grounded in physiological changes in the body. Maybe what we're doing is we are really changing people's whole being, not just their muscles or their joints. And I started to look at pain after that. Now, my journey with pain took me along many different paths, but one of the paths that I've been looking at recently and we're very curious about is how we understand the internal world, how we understand our bodies, how we feel our bodies, and the scientific word for that is interoception. And this is what I want to talk to you guys about today. So I gather you guys have some pain modules here, is that right? Yeah? And I gather that you then put your hand up if you've done that module yet. Okay, great. So if I use terms like nociception, you'll understand what that means. Okay, good. So for those who don't, we'll go over it briefly. Are you presented with the predictive processing model, or the Bayesian brain at all?
Not so much.
Not so much. A lot of blank faces. Okay. So we'll see if we can briefly summarize that, because that underpins a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing. So let's begin with a little exercise. So I'm going to set a timer, and I'm going to set a timer for 4 minutes, and we are going to stay absolutely still for 4 minutes, not moving a single muscle, and we'll see what happens. So everybody find a position, ideally one that you find yourself in often during the day, that you know you're going to be sitting in for more than 4 minutes. And when you found yourself in that position, I'll give you 3 seconds, 2, 1, and I've started the timer. So I want you to begin to pay attention inwards. And first thing I want you to do is to notice that actually staying completely still is not easy. It requires energy to stop yourself from fidgeting and from moving. Next thing I want you to do is to see if you can notice the sensation of wanting to move. Notice what the quality of that sensation is like. Notice that the body asks for movement with a distinct feeling. And as that feeling grows, like it's doing right now in my left big toe, it starts to build from a whisper to a shout, and eventually it will scream at you. And the sensation is often discomfort. So right now my toe is becoming quite uncomfortable. I've got it bent for some reason. So my muscles are exerting force to hold it in that bent position. And if I ask that sensation using my thought processes, somebody at the back is definitely cheating. What do you want to do, toe? Like, what action are you asking me to do with that sensation of discomfort? The toe presents to me an image of wanting to extend. So is anybody else feeling discomfort in their body at the moment? Good. So for somebody who is feeling discomfort, can you describe where that is in your body? Sorry? Okay, where in your leg?
My neck.
Oh, your neck, sorry. Where, so in your neck, can you ask that sensation, hey neck, what do you really want to do right now? What happens?
It wants to extend.
It wants to extend. How much?
45 degrees.
45 degrees, very specific, lovely. And does it want to hold that extension or does it want to move out of that extension again? Move out of that extension. So it almost wants to nod at a 45-degree angle, is that right? Fantastic. Anybody else? The same. Neck wants to nod. Notice somebody else is moving.
Here's my right is feeling rusty. I feel like I'm sitting in the correct way, so.
So it wants you to even the weight distribution. And if you ask it again, does it even want to stand up, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. And when you imagine doing the movements that that discomfort is asking for, what do you imagine it feeling like? Relief, right? Pleasant relief. It's not just the absence of that discomfort anymore, it might almost be pleasure of relieving that discomfort. So there's 20 seconds left. So for those who are not feeling any discomfort at the moment, see if you can scan your body quickly. Often hands, glutes, feet. They generally complain first. Your heart's beating faster. Okay, so I want everybody to now move in the way your body is asking for, please. So spend a moment. If you want to stand up, stand up. If your head wants to move at 45 degrees, move your head at 45 degrees. Okay? And notice the feeling of moving the body in response to discomfort. So we all have inbuilt in us a sense of our internal world that demands things of us. And let's notice for a second how specific the commands are from these feelings of discomfort. Your neck wanted to move 45 degrees into extension and out again a couple of times. Of all of the ranges that the neck can possibly do, that range is very specific to that particular sensation. And when you do the movement that the sensation is asking for, there is a sense of relief, a sense of pleasure. And what this means is that we have a fundamental orientation, a fundamental compass that dictates our behavior, that is a movement from discomfort to comfort, discomfort to pleasure. And that's a very physical sense change. Now, just imagine for a second, if you were able to teach every single one of your patients who came into your clinic what the sensations meant that they were experiencing in their body, how to listen to them and respond to them accurately so that they were able to move their bodies to restore their health based upon their internal senses. How well would your patients be? And how reliant would they be on your care versus themselves?
They could become over-aware.
That's a very, very good point. So it completely depends on the lens at which you look through those internal sensations. Because you can be extremely aware of your internal sensations and also be a hypochondriac, fearful of what they mean. right? So if you're looking at this internal world through the lens of fear, generally what you tend to do is to trigger a stress response, freeze response. And that freeze response results in an increase in that internal discomfort, so then it becomes a bigger part of your awareness, you become more scared of it, and it starts an upward cycle that ends up in a panic attack. So the really important thing, if you want to teach this to people and learn it for yourself, is to look through a lens of curiosity and not just stick at the point where you are feeling the sensation, but respond to the sensation with movement. Looking always for that relief, that sense of pleasure. Because it's easy to get stuck in the discomfort. We're all so good at it. But if we learn to move and respond to that discomfort accurately, it's no longer an object of fear, because you're able to have control and agency. Now, the thing we fear most is having lack of agency and lack of control. The unknown is one of the most fearful things. Okay, so we're going to see if we can explain what you just experienced in neurobiological terms and teach you how it can be applied to your patients in clinic and first to yourself. In order to do that, we first need to look at how life began. So, our current understanding of how life began is it began at the bottom of the oceans in volcanic vents. So these volcanic vents are deep in the bottom of the ocean, in between the tectonic plates, with magma underneath, and they spit up hot, mineral-rich water into the ocean. In the pores of these rocks, there are little enclosed spaces of relatively alkaline water. And they are enclosed within the pores of the rock, and so they have an environment that remains relatively stable. It doesn't change very much. And in the ancient oceans, we believe that they were very acidic, and we believe that life started in these pores of the rock, in this relatively stable little environment. The first thing to evolve was the very first RNA molecule. Now, you know about RNA, right? So this first RNA molecule, what does RNA do within cells? Remind me? It does DNA. What does it do?
Proteins.
Make proteins, exactly. So the very first RNA made a copy of itself, out of amino acids, out of proteins. And it started reproduction. Started the first generation and the first gene. So each gene codes for a specific set of proteins, a specific sequence of amino acids. And the first gene coded for a cell. So as evolution happened, somehow, I don't know how, but this hard rock's shell was replaced by a lipid bilayer with the same concentration of alkaline to acid inside and without the cell, and the little RNA molecules encased within this lovely little membrane. And it was mobile, it was floating around in the sea. Now, as soon as you have a membrane like this, you have certain rules in order to maintain life. Life is the maintenance of, it is an attempt to maintain a steady state, an attempt to maintain this thing that we call homeostasis. Homeo meaning same, stasis meaning state. Now, in this cell, there are certain things that need to happen. And these are the things we've got up here. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to maintain this membrane. Why? Because if we don't maintain this membrane, then all of our cellular contents leak out and we die. So we need to maintain the physical body. We need to balance fluids and electrolytes across this membrane so that we maintain the balance of pH, the balance of ions, we drink effectively. We need to excrete waste products, and we need to incorporate nutrients in order to generate energy to maintain homeostasis. Finally, we need to reproduce, pass on our genes to the next generation. So these fundamental rules for maintaining life haven't changed since the very, very beginning. we still need to do exactly the same things as human beings as the first cell did in terms of these functions. And how we do these functions has changed, but the basic requirements haven't. Now, we know, obviously, that at some point, unicellular organisms evolved to form multicellular organisms. Large multicellular organisms with many different cells organized in different tissues. Now, in order for these cells to maintain homeostasis, they need to somehow engage the whole organism to move in the environment, to drink, to eat, to transport sugars and nutrients back to these cells. So how does each individual tiny community of cells engage the organism when it has something to report that actually their environment is no longer that optimal? Say, for example, these little cells are starting to get really acidic. There's a buildup of acid around the cells because they've been metabolizing loads. They've resulted in a lot of carbon dioxide being excreted into their tissues. This carbon dioxide dissolves into an acid. And this is building up to a point where they're starting to die. What are they going to do? Pain. Okay, but is the pain located in the cells? No, right? Chemoreceptors, who said that? Detect the change, right? So the only way the cells in these local little communities that make up our whole bodies have to communicate with the entire organism to say, hey, you need to breathe a bit more because we've got to get rid of this carbon dioxide is via the nervous system. Communicating with the brain. Now, how does the nervous system communicate with the brain? What kind of information does it travel? It travels in the nervous system. Electrical impulses, precisely, action potentials, right? So these electrical impulses, these action potentials, communicate to the brain in different frequencies of information, right? They either stream in high frequency information or low frequency information. If high frequency information was a sound, what would it be? Right? If low frequency information was a sound, what would it be? Thanks very much. Good, so here we have low frequency information, here we have high frequency information. So this is the only thing that the brain is receiving from the internal body and from the external world, right? So how the hell does our brain create the rich perceptual world that we exist in if the only thing it has access to is frequencies of nerve impulses, either high frequency or low frequency? How does that happen? Isn't that extraordinary? Like, if you just think about what you're seeing and feeling and hearing right now, the whole thing is constructed just based upon these varying frequencies of information. And obviously the nerves have to be supported by the cells of the glial cells and the heart beating and us breathing and the plants producing oxygen and the plants producing food so we can then maintain this whole state. But really, the information that goes on in the brain is just frequencies of nerve fire. So the current model in which we understand the way in which we form perceptions is that light hits the eye, it transports messages back to the back of the brain, and when it reaches the visual cortex, some miraculously thing happens and we perceive the thing that we're seeing. Yeah, are we all in agreement that this kind of model is what we've been taught? How the hell does that work if you're throwing and catching? So, in order to catch something, so something I can throw that's pretty innocuous, not really. This, can you catch? Good catch, nicely done. Okay. Throw it back. So, if this can happen, whoa, how much processing is involved in that throwing and catching? What has to happen? A lot, right? So you have to perceive this like stick that's flying through the air. You have to perceive the light that's bouncing off it. This has to then be sent to the visual cortex, which then has to calculate the speed, the size, the trajectory, Then it has to send that information to the motor cortex, to then send it back down to the arm, to be able to move the arm in space, open the hand, and then catch the object in space, right? If this happened in that sequence of information, it would be extremely inefficient. It's very unlikely that we would be able to act in the world if we were sensing and responding in that way. Because there's just too much processing that needs to be done. So how do we act in the world? How are we able to do that, throw and catch? So we need to start looking at babies. So, babies are born with an excess of neurons. They're born with too many connections in their brain. And human babies are born the most premature out of any species. We give birth to the babies that are the least prepared for this world. You see a giraffe being born, it's already got fur, it can walk straight out the womb. Human babies can't do anything, really. I mean, they can cry and they can signal to us discomfort. But they're born with too many synapses. And in the first year of life, first 8 months of life, in fact, up to about 2 years of life, the baby's brain is not generating new synapses, it is pruning off unnecessary synapses. It is going through a process of refining. So let's say, for example, when the baby originally is born, the synapses that are connecting the movements of the arm are also wired up to the movements of the opposite leg, because there's too many connections going on. So every time the baby intends to try and reach for the mother, the leg is also moving. And you can see this in babies' movements, they're relatively chaotic. So as the baby repeatedly does this, it engages in a process of going, well, actually this is really inefficient for me to move my leg at the same time as moving my arm, so let's sever that connection. Let's rebuild the connections between my visual system and my arm so I can reach more efficiently, and sever the connections to the rest of the body which are no longer needed for me to do the reaching, pruning off and refining. So they engage in a process of pruning, but they also engage in a process of neuroplasticity. So is everybody familiar with neuroplasticity? So what does neuroplasticity mean? There's a few nodding heads here. The ability for the nervous system to adapt and change, precisely. Has everybody seen the taxi driver study, the black cabbie brain study? Yeah? So for those who haven't, does anybody know what is required of black cabbies to become a black cab driver? They have to pass the knowledge. Put your hand up if you know what the knowledge is as a test. Okay, great. So the knowledge, and you'll see some people driving around on scooters that have like a little clipboard in front of them with a map on it. You have to remember every single street in London. You have to go around and you have to spend 4 years remembering the entirety of London. So that when you get into a black cab and you say, I want to go to the Marriott Hotel in Swiss Cottage, they know exactly how to get there and where it is. From memory, not from GPS. Because they had to do this before GPS existed. So you can imagine that part of their brain that's responsible for encoding visuospatial memory is going to be worked hard, right? It's going to be going to the gym and it's going to be lifting weights a lot. And as a result, it grows. And when you dissect black cab drivers' brains, what you find is the hippocampus, which is responsible for encoding visuospatial memory, is massive in comparison to normal individuals. It's physically much larger. So what this means is that our brain grows according to how we use it. And it does this in various different ways. So the ways in which the brain can grow is it can grow new synapses. So it can branch each nerve cell, doesn't have to grow a whole new nerve cell to make new connections. It can just grow a new axon and then synapse with another neuron, growing a new synapse. It can build more myelin around the neurons. So the myelin sheaths, the oligodendrocytes, can increase the amount of myelination. Or we can build more ion channels in the synapse themselves. So if we have more ion channels on the postsynaptic membrane, and we have increased likelihood that a small amount of neurotransmitter will depolarize that next neuron. And this can be made from cell bodies. We can transport new ion channels, and this is often a process that happens in sensitization. We actually grow more ion channels in the synapse. And if we combine the effects of all of these changes, we can potentiate, meaning we can make it easier for one network to activate by 3,000 times by increasing the conductive speed and reducing the refractory period between the activation of the neurons and increasing the ion density. So if you continually repeat doing a specific action like throwing and catching, the networks that are responsible for you throwing and catching when you've mastered it can conduct their information up to 3,000 times faster than somebody who has never practiced doing that thing. Much, much more rapidly activated. So you can imagine a baby is growing. A baby has too many connections in their brain. They really don't have language. They don't have an understanding of the world that's based in the same way as it would be when they start to grow. But they have a huge amount of plastic change happening. And they also have an environment with repeated experiences. So, as the baby goes through their life, they start to encounter the world. Oh, come on, YouTube. I dare you to work. Okay, so if this doesn't work, then that's fine. We can look at it later. Okay. Sorry about this, guys. Which one is it? Yeah, I think it's this. So, what you can see here, I wish we had sound. Is there any sound? No, we don't. Okay.
Is it? Would you like this?
If you can, that'd be really nice. If you can't, it's not too important. So just watch this baby exploring the world. So as the baby crawls, as the baby encounters the world, what they have is repeated actions that encounter the world, right? You'll notice a baby, if it lies on its back, it will kick its legs and it will hit its little feet into the floor, creating repetitive, predictable actions that when I push my feet down, activate these particular muscles, I will encounter the floor and it will have a particular density. And through repeated experience, I start to connect that density, activated by the sensory receptors, with that particular movement, pushing into the ground. That's okay, it doesn't matter. So with repeated experience, we start to create connections between these different parts of our nervous systems, right? We start to build an internal representation of the world. Don't worry about it. Honestly, it's not,
sure.
It's not that important.
Thank you.
Sorry. So you can see the baby's experimenting here, using its knowledge of what happens with the ground, that the ground is dense, to be able to experiment with different forms of action, to then move towards the intended target. Through a process of refining this cycle between feeling and acting, then reacting, and then re-feeling. Until you start to be able to move in a way that achieves the goal that you're attempting to achieve. So as this happens, imagine what's going on in the baby's brain. The baby is forming representations about the world. And there's a fundamental curiosity. So, it wasn't quite the video that we're looking for, but I think it demonstrates the point. So, when we are repeating movements, when we're repeatedly encountering the world, neuroplastic process is going on, and we start to build an internal model of the world. So, what this means is that we are forming representations, representations. And with the current understanding of how brains form perceptions, we perceive not based upon what's actually out there in the world, because as we've seen with the throwing and catching metaphor, it's too slow. But we perceive based on these representations that we create within our brain. And we refine these representations through the sensory incoming data. So we have this balance between what we predict is out there and what is actually out there being reported by our senses.
Why is like using an internal model of stuff, a ball in the air more efficient than seeing the ball actually moving?
Very good question. So let's take the ball in the air metaphor, okay? So we'll go with it. Okay, so the ball is flying through space. Now, if we use this model of perceiving and acting according to our hypotheses, as opposed to responding to the actual sensory information, what are we going to do? What we're going to do is we're going to make a prediction about where that ball is going to be arriving in space. And we're going to move our bodies in response to where we predict that ball is going to be. So we're already in space, having a prediction about where that ball is traveling. We're predicting, based upon our past experience of catching, how that ball is going to fly through space. And we respond, act according to that prediction. But then, say, for example, we predicted the ball is going to land here, but actually it's traveling a little bit to the left, and it looks like it's actually going to hit me in the face. What I can then do is use the incoming sense data from the actual location of the ball to update this prediction and move my arm a little bit to the left rather than having to move my arm all the way up here, because I've already moved in response to my prediction and refined that prediction based upon the sense data, not moved just as a result of the sense data. Does that answer your question? So this is a really crucial concept, because what this does is it completely flips the whole role of sensation. Sensation is no longer sense data. We no longer feel stretch. We feel what we anticipate, and we use the sense data as error messages to fill the gap between what we predict is out there and what is really out there.
Can you give another example of another?
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's say, for example, you are walking along the street and you're looking out over like a back alley, for example, and you see somebody sitting down at the back alley crouching on the ground. And you're like, that person looks really strange. Why have they got like a shoulder that's sticking out at right angles like that? Oh wait, hold on, no, it's just a pile of rubbish. Okay, and then you move on, get on with your day, right? This kind of thing happens all the time. So in this formulation, what you've done is you've had a hypothesis, an inference, that there is a person in this alley, and you perceive this person really is there. If you were to stop time at that moment and ask that person, was there a person in that alley, they'd say, yes, I saw a person. And then use their eyes to look and stare at the actual thing that they think is there, and they use the incoming data from their eyes to update that hypothesis, going, actually, the angles don't match for a real person if it's not moving, right? And that sense data then communicates error between the prediction and the reality, and you update your hypothesis and then perceive rubbish facts instead. Yeah? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, we have the same process going on for our internal world, our interoceptive world. And most of the times, particularly in modern day society, we're never required to inquire deeply into our internal world. Now, there's one more thing that we need to understand with this formulation. We need to understand precision. Because the ultimate role of the brain is to try and get us to act in the world in an optimal way, in a way that is most efficient and most useful for action. So let's take the example of driving home in a fog. Right, so say you're driving home, it's a familiar road, you've done it a lot of times, but the fog is dense. You can only see like 3 meters in front of the car. So in this example, the real world out there is giving you very ambiguous data, right? The fog is obscuring your vision. You can't see anything, really. And when the data is ambiguous out there, your brain has to still act in the world. You've still got to drive home. So it's got to make a decision, in inverted commas, about what to rely on, your predictions or the sense data. And because you've driven this road a lot of times, you're likely to perceive the world based upon the predictions, because you can't rely on the sense data you're getting because it's foggy as hell. You can't see properly. So you can generate more precise perceptions based upon the hypotheses. So you see the tree on the left that you know signals that you need to turn right in 100 meters, so you kind of see that tree and then you begin to turn right even though you can't see the turning you're going into, because you know it's there and you perceive that turning sooner than it actually necessarily being there. Does that make sense to everybody? So the brain tries to match the most precise perceptions. And similarly, if you were driving home in a new place on a bright sunny day, you may be paying attention much more to what your senses are actually telling you rather than what you predict is out there, because it's very clear. You can see well, the data is very precise. Now let's take that into a perception of one's own internal body. In order to have a representation of our internal body, we need to practice feeling it. And if we have never practiced feeling the internal sensations in our body, that's effectively having a very, very foggy, a very, very imprecise perceptual data to draw upon. So you don't know what the internal sensations mean. So you don't have any accurate data to sample. And this is the case with so many of the pain patients who come into clinic and who are particularly experiencing chronic pain. Okay, so any questions at this point? I've already thrown a lot of information at you. How are your brains doing? Put your hand up if you need to stand up and move around a bit, get some blood back to your brain. So I'm seeing a few blank faces. Okay, let's do that. Everyone stand up. Okay. While we're standing, let's begin to stretch a little bit. So let's bring one arm up. And as you move one side over, make sure you don't pinch the side you're bending towards. Let's stretch the side you're bending away from. It helps to breathe in here. Breathing in also oxygenates your blood, so you can actually get that blood to your brain, so you can continue to build connections and learn. Good. I don't hear many people taking deep breaths. You need some oxygen, guys. Breathing in deeply as you reach. Stay one more time. On the other side, breathing in deeply as you reach. Can you feel the sensation of stretch? Can you feel the sensation of pressure on the side you're bending towards? Yeah? Can you feel how different they are? Let's do that again. Bending forwards this time. Bring a bit of blood to your brain. It's nice to wiggle in this position. Can you feel the lengthening of your erector spinae muscles? Feel the lengthening of your hamstrings, and maybe your sciatic nerve is burning into your calves and tingling in your feet. Now breathing in as you come up. And make sure you're not too lightheaded before you go into extension. Feel the pressure of your joints becoming loaded, going in towards their end range. You notice the distinct difference in those sensations? Yes? No? Yeah? How many of your patients do you think know the difference between pressure and stretch?
Honestly, some people
5.
don't. Yeah.
Most of them don't, right? And if they're going to the gym and they're thinking, yeah, the teacher said that this is a really good stretch here, I'm really stretching my body, but actually they're just feeling the joints becoming compressed on the side they're bending towards. They would describe that to you as feeling a stretch. But actually their joints are coming to their end range, they've got nowhere to go, and they're likely to hurt themselves. Because they're not actually loading the tissues that are responsible for resisting load, the muscles. They've got to the end range of their joints and they're pushing it, because they've been told to, because they don't know what those sensations mean. So we need to build for our patients a good understanding of their internal worlds, and we can do that with our hands-on manual therapy. Okay, how much time do I have left? Okay.
2 hours, including questions, until 8.
Great.
We don't have to
Okay.
kick you out in advance. So
Okay, great. Cool, we've got
I've
time.
got a question about
Yeah.
I mean, the worry's been that you often don't get much sort of structural problems or, harm that's actually causing pain, even when it's related to people saying, that they put their back out lifting something at work, and that was 2 months ago.
Yeah.
I was wondering what your take is on it.
Well, if we appreciate the pain as a perception, and the perception is based not upon the actual incoming data from the nociceptors, but based upon what we predict is going to happen, then it's likely that the cultural memes that we have around the back, and the back being a fragile structure that we need to protect, and everyone, if you've got lower back pain, you're not going to be able to work, all of these things construct meaning, right? And these things, if it means a lot to this person, then it's much more threatening for them, and they're going to perceive based upon the meaning, not based upon the actual incoming sense data. Especially if they haven't practiced the difference in feeling in their body, they can't differentiate what's going on in terms of the actual sense data. So their back pain becomes catastrophic and they feel more pain. Because we don't perceive the world based upon what's really there, we perceive the world based upon what we anticipate. Yeah? Do you have a question? Are you stretching your fingers? Okay.
How do we change that?
How do we change that? Is a very good question. Okay, first we need to understand it. So, what we're going to talk about today is interoception, but I want to compare and contrast interoception with nociception. So, interoception, as I define it here, I take Craig's definition of the physiological sense of the condition of the body. The physiological sense of the condition of the body. So this directly points to homeostasis, feeling the physiological state of the body. Now, nociception, noci meaning noxious, ception meaning perception, is a neural process of encoding noxious stimuli. Noxious meaning potentially threatening or potentially damaging to the tissues. Now let's look at the pathways. So, hopefully by now you've all seen this kind of table. And if you don't remember it, I do not blame you at all. It's hard to remember. This one, for me, is much easier. Sensory neurons from the periphery. They come in various different sizes. The bigger they are, how does that relate to their speed? The bigger they are, the faster they conduct their information, right? And the more myelin they have, the faster they go. So, therefore, C fibers are the slowest, B fibers are a little bit faster, B fibers are faster still, and group 1A fibers are the fastest. Now, these three, and particularly these guys here, are what we're going to focus on today. So, we traditionally classify the D fibers and the C fibers terminating in free nerve endings in the tissues. So these have nerve endings that don't end in specialized sensory receptors like the Ruffini or Pacinian corpuscles that are responsible for our proprioceptive and mechanoreceptive information. It's non-noxious. But the C fibers and the D fibers pick up on mechanical, thermal, or chemical changes. Okay? Is this familiar to everybody? Good, okay, so we'll run through it quite quickly then. So a lot of the D fibers and B fibers, because some B fibers do terminate in free nerve endings as well, these are generally sensitive to mechanical and thermal changes. Why? Because mechanical and thermal changes generally come at us quickly and we need to respond to them quickly. So therefore it helps to have a fat myelinated fiber that conducts its information quickly. And these B fibers and D fibers, they synapse in the dorsal horn in lamina 4 here. Now, lamina 4 encodes nociceptive information and interoceptive information based upon changes in temperature and mechanical stimulus. So these are the fibers that are going to be responsible for you picking up that pan from the oven with the classic metaphor, and it's too hot because you've forgotten to put on your oven gloves, so you have to withdraw away and you drop your food on the floor, right? So in order to respond quickly to that, to protect the state of your tissues from being burned, the fibers that do that are myelinated, they're D fibers, they're B fibers, and they orchestrate the skeletal muscle in withdrawal reflexes. Okay, is that clear for everybody? Yeah? So these withdrawal reflexes are encoded in the lamina 4 portion of the spinal cord, which is distinct from the lamina 1 C fiber incoming connections. Now the C fibers, they conduct their information slowly. They conduct their information slowly, and they're polymodal. Most of them are responsible not just to not just to mechanical and thermal information, but also chemical changes. And it's these C fibers that we can class in this formulation homeostatic fibers. So we can see here that these C fibers come in two different types, peptidergic and non-peptidergic C fibers. They terminate in free nerve endings in the tissues, and they have all of these different receptor types on their nerve endings. So these are polymodal because they're sensitive to heat, mechanical, osmotic pressure changes, cooling, also menthol. That's why when you eat menthol, it gets cold. We played in my CPD a fun experiment with giving people chili and menthol at the same time to see if they cancel each other out. Try it. I recommend it. Sorry? No, try it. I recommend it. Yeah, it's a good experiment. Tell me what happens afterwards. So they're also sensitive to acid changes, which is a direct reflection of the metabolism of the tissues, how much carbon dioxide is being produced by the mitochondria. Sensitive to nerve growth factor, which is tissue healing response, and sensitive to local inflammatory molecules from the immune system via these G-coupled receptors. So these little C fibers are effectively checking in on how much acid there is in these tissues, how hot those tissues are, how cold those tissues are, how much they're being stretched, how much pressure is going on, have they got enough fluids around the cells. They are checking in on the state of health of all the tissues, and we find them absolutely everywhere. These nerve fibers are in everywhere except for the brain itself. And so when we start to classify these fibers, and we classify them as only nociceptors, which is common, we run into a little bit of an issue because we find when we study them that they're active all the time. They're not just active when we are receiving noxious or potentially damaging stimuli. These C fibers are setting off nerve impulses at rest when you're not doing anything. And it seems that these C fibers are not just nociceptors, though when there is a high threshold mechanical stimulation or an increase in temperature or lots of acid or lots of inflammation, they get really active. but they're actually homeostatic fibers that are reporting the state of the tissues to the brain at all times, giving us an internal sense of ourselves. And these fibers travel in a pathway to lamina 1, and they travel and they decussate at the level of the spinal cord and travel up the spinothalamic tract. And in the spinothalamic tract, in the traditional version, this is what you'll see in most of your textbooks, they travel up to the thalamus, where they join the neurons from the pyramidal tracts, the lemniscal neurons, carrying sensory touch and proprioceptive information, and communicate to the somatosensory cortex. Right, you're familiar with this, or I've done it once, you may not remember it. It took me a long, long time to remember this. Now, this actually is not accurate. This is based upon Penfield's experiments and various neurologists in the 1900s playing around with brains of epileptic patients. And it seems that the sensory motor cortex, this S1 and M1 area of the brain, is organized somatotopically. Everybody's seen the homunculus before, right? Now this was discovered by Penfield because he had epileptic patients, and he was trying to work out where it was in their brain this epileptic seizures was coming from. So he had patients whose cranium was cut off, their brain was exposed, they were awake, and he'd get a little electrode and he'd poke their brains. And when he found that he poked this area, the patients would report a buzzing sensation in parts of their body. And so he started to poke in a line up this person's brain, and he noticed that buzzing sensation moved from the finger up the hand, up the arm. And so he summarized that this area of the brain is organized in a somatotopic map. But the sensation when this area was triggered was not pain. It was buzzing or tingling sensations. And they summarized that this area receives painful information from the C fibers, even though this area didn't cause pain when it's directly stimulated. And when they tried to remove this area in people who had chronic intractable pain, their pain didn't go away. So this guy, Bud Craig, who has spent 25 years of his research looking at the difference between the somatosensory pathway and the lamina 1 C fiber pathways, the spinothalamic tract, started to notice that actually these C fibers that are checking in on the state of our tissues don't travel in the same tract as the large diameter sensory neurons do. They come in, they synapse in lamina 1, they travel up the spinothalamic tract, and they synapse in the brainstem with the nucleus tractus solitarius here, which is the part of the brain that integrates all the information from the vagus nerve. So it integrates all the information coming in from the parasympathetic nerves, from our viscera. And then he worked out that it travels up to the thalamus and synapses not with the somatosensory cortex, but goes into the insula and to the anterior cingulate. Now, the insula is an area that seems to encode the whole interior of the body, the viscera, changes in temperature, changes in acidity. And it connects to the anterior cingulate, which was responsible for our attentional resources, dictating what we pay attention to. Now, it just so happens that this network, when we get to the brain level, this is the insular cortex, which it synapses to. When we get to the brain level, what we see is that the terminations for these lamina 1 C fiber neurons, they terminate in the insula and the anterior cingulate, which are both intimately connected with our sense of self and our salience network. Now, our salience network determines what we pay attention to. It determines what we orientate towards, and then what we feel about something, and therefore what we pay attention to. And it activates our motivational circuits too, because what we pay attention to, we need to engage energy towards that thing. We tend to be motivated either towards it or away from it. So what he's painting in this picture is that the same neurons that are responsible for checking in on the homeostasis of our tissues are the same system that is deciding or informing what is important to us, what is valuable to us. So what that means is if we don't have a good sense of our own selves, we don't know how to make good decisions. We don't have this kind of internal compass that decides what's important in our lives and what's not. And the research points to people who have poor interoceptive awareness being very poor at regulating their own emotional state, at empathizing with other people, at making decisions. It tends to be associated with things like ADHD. And when we're thinking about pain, we see that the people who have chronic pain in particular, the changes that we see in their brains are in these very same regions. Sorry. So, the interior state of our body informs the networks in our brain that decides what's important for us to pay attention to or not. They inform our limbic system and inform our emotional processes. We also notice that people who have a poor connectivity in their insula and their anterior cingulate can't understand other people's emotions. So it seems that we build our understanding of other people based upon our understanding of our internal selves. And the areas of the brain that change with people who have chronic pain are these very same regions. So the more red this area is of the brain, the less connectivity it has. The more it's lost its function. And what we see here is two massive red circles around the insula and the anterior cingulate. These two regions that are responsible for feeling the internal state of the body and directing our attention.
I mean, who are we looking at in the diagram? Is this a before after, or?
This is a chronic pain patient. This is a meta-analysis of hundreds and hundreds of different MRI studies of chronic pain patients.
Yep.
And this is a summary of all the data and the brain regions, the connectivity maps of those brains.
And the right-hand one is?
The right-hand one is an increase in connectivity.
Okay.
So this is areas that have lost function, this is areas that have gained function.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay, so what this means is, and this is supported by the literature, chronic pain is correlated with a significantly reduced ability to feel the internal state of the body and respond to it. And if the feeling of the internal state of the body is a direct reflection of the homeostasis, the health of the body tissues, if you lose the ability to feel it, you lose the ability to restore yourself to health because you don't understand what your internal messages are. You don't know what it means. And we can restore people's ability to feel their bodies. Okay, so how do we do this? So we touch people, right? And the way in which we touch people is we touch people's bodies and we move their bodies. We get their bodies to do things dictated by our hands that feel safe. And this is where I have a fundamental issue with the way in which a lot of osteopathy is done, harking to the conversation that was here last week, is that so often when we're treating people, we are not engaging people's attention inside their own bodies. So often when we're treating people, we are treating them and their minds are elsewhere. And we are assuming that we're making changes in their body, and we may be making actual changes in their body. But what's really crucial if we want to move people away from pain is to engage people's perception. We need to teach people about their own bodies inside the therapeutic interaction. So I've given you a lot of information, so I think let's make this a little bit more practical, shall we? Let's get you to pair up, and we'll use a shoulder because you're all sitting and you can move shoulders in the positions that you're in. You're going to palpate the person's shoulder who's next to you, who you've paired up with. You're going to palpate it, and you're going to feel the state of the muscles around the deltoid, around the traps. So you get an idea of the objective quality of those tissues. Okay? So, palpate each other, find a shoulder. Now, imagine you're in a clinical interaction and you're not palpating another osteopath, you're palpating somebody who doesn't know medical terminology, who's a real patient. Okay? So, feel the shoulder and do what you would normally do in clinic. Your tutors have told you not to use medical jargon, so you're feeling the shoulder.
Just palpating it.
Just palpating it, yeah. You can move it if you like, that informs your palpation. What is going on inside your brain as the practitioner, inside your perceptions? Hopefully you're getting a good idea of the state of this shoulder that you're feeling, right? What's going on in the mind and the brain of the patient? Where are their attention directed? To the touch, maybe. To you? To me?
So that's, yeah.
Yeah, so away from the shoulder, yeah. How can we tell? You have to ask, right? Because we have no access other than words and non-verbal communication to another person's perception, right? And it's guaranteed that we do not perceive the world in the same way. So let's carry on feeling the shoulder. And what you're going to do now is you're going to ask the question, is this person's interoception accurate according to what I feel? And the way in which you're going to gauge whether your patient has an accurate representation of their internal world, based upon what you feel from the outside, is you're going to ask the question, what do you feel? What do you feel when I'm pressing on your shoulder here? And try and answer honestly. Okay, so what answers did you get? Not much. Ouch. Felt pain? Okay. Feels dense. Yeah. Feels pressure. Like it wants to be touched more there. Great. What else? Anybody else get information about what they felt? And what did you do as a patient who was being asked that question? What happened? What did you do in response to that question?
When you asked, how did they feel?
When you were asked, what do you feel? You start thinking about it, right? So your attentional processes are engaged. And where are they directed? Are they directed outside at the street? Right? They're directed inwards to the place that you're being touched. So this question, what do you feel, causes the patient to inquire into their own internal sensations. It connects them directly with their interoceptive world and then forces them to take the muddy world that is and put language to it. Separate out all of those muddy internal sensations and try to describe the difference between density and a feeling like it wants to be massaged.
Interesting, because I didn't even know, I don't really know how to answer that question. And then
Right.
my osteopath in my head said, well, I feel rib, it's like, okay, and then I have to kind of zoom out of it again and think, okay, and then zoom into my interoception instead of going straight to my head again.
Well noticed. Very well noticed. You've got a good awareness of where you're paying attention. That's a really important skill.
I was thinking, I mean, is there something of a challenge in this? Because as a patient, you understand your shoulders, sort of, this thing that's at the top of your arm which has an interesting shape, and
yeah,
in terms of, I don't know, especially if you've got pain there, like particular points of contact and where they are probably quite foreign, and you don't have any landmarks to associate them with.
Yeah, you don't. All you have is your internal sensation, right? You don't have the anatomy books, you don't have the prior understanding. But you can tell the difference between a contracted muscle and a relaxed muscle. You can tell the difference between a hot muscle and a cold muscle. You can tell the difference between pressure and stretch. You can tell the difference between a feeling of fatigue or a feeling of energized, right? So we start to, if we want to teach people about their internal sensations, we don't necessarily have to teach them anatomy. We just have to teach them the difference between a contracted muscle and a relaxed muscle. Difference between a fatigued muscle and a muscle that needs to be worked more. Difference between pressurized joint and stretched joint. And I guarantee that this will be much easier for them to feel than trying to describe to them the anatomy. And if you start to put packets of information, language, words, to each one of those distinct sensations, you can start to teach them what those sensations mean, changing their internal models and updating their sense of themselves. So if you can teach your patients, this is what stretch feels like, and that when you're in this stretch position, I want you to relax into it. Bring oxygen to that muscle by breathing. Then they know how to change the state of muscle, responding to their internal sensations. If you give exercises and say, hey, do this exercise until the point of fatigue, then they start to inquire into their internal sensations while they're doing the exercise and learn what muscle fatigue feels like. If you start to say, hey, look, this is pressurizing your joints here, don't push into that feeling of pressure because it's going to aggravate that disc or that joint that's already irritated. They know the feeling of pressure is one they need to be careful with. So they start to build an understanding of what the sensations mean and how to respond to them, giving them agency, dictated by your hands and how you communicate. So the key question is, what am I getting my patients to pay attention to in my sessions? And how am I getting them to learn about themselves? Does that answer the question? Yeah? Okay, how was that to do? Yeah.
Is there literature and studies that show this has improved benefits on patients?
Very good question. So, the way in which we touch people can inform directly the insula and the interoceptive architecture. And it turns out that the C fibers aren't just responsible for noxious stimulation, they are homeostatic fibers, but they're also perceptive to a certain type of soft touch. And we have these C tactile fibers in the skin, particularly hairy skin. And you imagine how a baby would mother would comfort a baby when they're crying. How would you stroke a baby? Like pat, harmonic, and you gently stroke the baby, right? You wouldn't stroke them really fast, and you wouldn't necessarily be very static. You wouldn't stroke them really hard, you'd be quite light. And when you observe babies and mothers across cultures, every mother that you seem to observe when they're comforting the baby touches the baby in a very, very similar kind of way. And this is a touch that goes between 1 and 10 centimeters, that is moderate in depth and very reassuring. And this is the perfect kind of touch to activate these C tactile fibers in the skin. And when these C tactile fibers travel upwards to the brain, they synapse in the insula, and they release oxytocin and opioids into the central nervous system. Oxytocin, which potentiates the action of opioids, and opioids, as we know, are the most potent painkillers that we have, but they signal safety to us. So we can, using our touch, directly inform the insula, updating the interoceptive architecture, and release the most potent painkillers that we have by changing how we touch people. Now we know that attention dictates neuroplasticity. So if you're getting patients' attention to be paid inwards and repeated that, you're going to build the pathways that connect their awareness with their internal bodies. So once you combine this kind of touch with nociceptive kind of touch, which will also activate the same interoceptive architecture, with the patient's attention, describing their internal world, I guarantee you'll be able to change this interoceptive understanding and architecture of their brain. Yeah.
Just on the other hand, do you reckon if people hyperfixate then on the pain or a sensation, would that then cause a cascade of
Yeah. So
effects such as compassion?
definitely. Yeah. 100%. It's a really, really good point. So that's when it becomes crucial to understand the meaning of these sensations. Because in a catastrophizing patient, the sensations mean that they're never going to be able to walk again, right? Their pain contains a huge amount of meaning for them that is catastrophic, meaning that their life is going to be severely compromised by this sensation. Whereas if you can change the meaning of these sensations, for example, this sensation of pain that you're getting, what kind of pain is that? It feels like a pulling kind of pain. Well, a pulling kind of pain generally comes from a muscle that is either too contracted and pulling you, or it's pulling because you're stretching it. And if you give them the meaning that the muscle sensation, the pulling sensation, is either a contracted muscle or an overstretched muscle, then teach them how to either relax that muscle, unload it, it's no longer threatening anymore. Doesn't mean that they're going to lose their life. It's no longer catastrophic. So with somebody who is either hypochondriac or catastrophizing with their pain, you've got to engage in a process of changing the meanings so that they can respond better to the meanings. Does that make sense? Because you're right, a lot of people catastrophize their pain, and the pain means really negative things, and that's associated with a huge amount of fear. And often that fear is because they don't feel they have agency. But paying attention to what the actual sensations are, rather than fixating on the meaning, can give them back agency. Okay, so I'm going to round it up now. And just to bridge this gap a little bit. So the fundamental message that I'm trying to get across to you is that when we are treating our patients, we are perfectly situated, because we understand what the body is doing in health and disease, to teach people about what their body is doing and how to move them towards health. And we can use our hands and our mobilization techniques and our soft tissue techniques as tools to educate this person about how their body moves. But we have to engage that person's perception inwardly by asking key questions. Key questions like, what are you feeling? Key questions like, do you feel stretch? Do you feel pressure? Do you feel changes in temperature? What kind of pain is that you're experiencing? And if you're able to teach your patients what the sensations are trying to communicate to them, and teach them how to move in a way that alleviates those uncomfortable sensations, move in a way that moves them towards pleasure, like you did at the beginning of today's lesson, then you will give patients agency over their body, and you'll give them back a sense of self, which will affect their relationships, which will affect their emotional regulation, which will reduce their pain. That's the key jump that we need to make. We need to be asking the question all the time, how can I change this patient's perception of themselves, rather than me changing their body? Okay, and that's where I'm going to close for today. Thank you very much. So, yeah, we'll leave it for some questions.
We have time for some questions if anyone wants to ask them. Is this a TED Talk as well?
No, not yet. I mean, I'd love to do a TED Talk one day. That'd be great, but not yet.
I had a few questions.
Yeah.
The first one was, it's quite hard, I think, when you're still trying to get good at the same time when you're trying to do lots of different things at the same time. And if we really like simplify it, I mean, there's a psycho-emotional side and the interoceptive perception side of things, and then there's what you're actually doing with your hands. How would you recommend we balance those skills to how do you see the value of it physically doing it at a physiological level with articulating the joint, for example? How does that sit with the rest of what we're trying to do with this?
Great. Okay. Yeah. So let's take the example of articulating a joint. So you've got a stiff as hell frozen shoulder. Connective tissues have changed. They're thicker. They've built loads of collagen as a result of inflammation, and their shoulder does not move very much at all. You're in the stage where it's no longer painful. It's starting to thaw out, and you start to articulate that joint. So when you're articulating the joint, if you're using this model, the first question is to ask, okay, so what is being communicated from this joint to that patient's brain? How is that being communicated? So it's being communicated via these nociceptors that are, or these interoceptive fibers that are sensitive to stretch, acid changes, chemical changes, inflammation, temperature changes. So first of all, can I change the temperature of these connective tissues by warming them up a bit, inducing a bit of movement? Can I change the stretch of these tissues, mechanically stimulating them a little bit to get them moving a bit? And yes, we can do all of these things. We can improve the range of movement in the joint. But if the patient is telling you about what they have for lunch tomorrow because they've got a dinner party going on, they're not learning about how these changes are affecting themselves. They're not engaged with their own body and their own joint. So they're not going to have any kind of long-term change because you haven't engaged their brain in rewiring itself. You haven't taught them any new skills. You haven't started to change their behavior around it. So if you want to make the jump from having short-term articulation changes by using the same articulation technique, you've got to get them to learn about what those sensations mean while you're doing it, and then use that same movement, give it to them as an exercise afterwards, looking for those same sensations of benefit that they got while you had your hands on them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And whether that's it with, I guess the thing, I don't know about everyone else, but something that I do more of is asking questions about a person's interpretation of their symptoms.
Yeah.
But then that's very pain focused, and we're not necessarily reading anything. So this sounds like a much better, I mean, you definitely gave with that too, it sounds like a much better way to
Yes, yeah. And actually, like I do a CPD course on this stuff with more reference particularly to pain. And we go through like half of it. It's a weekend course, 2 days. And the format is half practical, half theory. So we actually just go through loads and loads of practical techniques and communication skills and how to do this in clinic with patients in a clinical interaction. And if you get this discount code, you get £100 off. It's in March, the 2nd and 3rd of March. So if you really want to learn those skills, I recommend coming to that course because it will give you this practical elements of integration. Yeah, any other questions?
So during treatment, were you talking to the patient what they've done weekend?
I mean, in my treatments, I don't tend to, no. Sometimes I do. If I witness that the patient is not willing to pay attention and they just want to like chat and relax, actually going to have a really therapeutic benefit on the whole system. So they've offloaded and they're chilled out, relaxed, fine. I'll chat about what their grandson did last night. But most of the time, I'm trying to think about how I can make long-term change. And I know that that's not really going to happen if their attention is engaged. So then I'll teach them about their bodies much more.
You hear a bit about sort of low back pain having very strong correlates with stuff like depression.
Yeah.
Where I mean which is like pretty intractable. There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there. What's your take on in terms of you teach people interoception and this kind of calming effect, but where that stands against their kind of life situation that got them there.
Yeah, that's a very big question. So first we need to recognize that pain is a meaning response. Pain is not directly connected to changes in the tissues. It's based upon how we interpret those changes and the meaning of those sensations. You know, we can have phantom limb pain, right? So therefore it's not dependent on the tissues. So if somebody is depressed, then their whole nervous system is geared towards interpreting meaning in a very negative light very often. And we look at the physiology of depression, we see that it's actually a hyperactivation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Everything is depressed. You can't engage energy systems. They aren't able to activate their sympathetics properly and sort of can't take action in the world. And learning processes are interrupted in depression as well. Neuroplasticity is inhibited. So if somebody is in pain, and you want to understand how that pain relates to their depression, you have to ask questions like, what does this pain mean to you? And get an understanding of what this pain is meaning in terms of their bigger picture of all the other things they've got going on in their life. And often depression comes when there's something overwhelming that they haven't been able to overcome or achieve or to do. There's a very negative self-image that comes with that too. And if you start to engage the affective touch system, there's very good evidence that it starts to give people ownership back over their bodies, over a sense of self. And if you have a sense of ownership over your sense of self, then you start to care for oneself. Because if you don't have any responsibility over it, don't have any relationship to it, why would you care for it? So in that situation, you may want to work more with the kind of C-tactile afferent system, while understanding what their pain means to them, and understanding your remit as a practitioner too. Like, what are my skills? Do I have the skills to be able to deal with depression? And if not, then I need to have a network of people around me who can deal with that. Therapists, psychologists, other people who can support me. Because if that's presentation, and this happens with a lot of chronic pain patients, right? It's not a familiar, easy picture. You often need a whole team. So then you need to refer. Does that help? Any other questions, comments, or thoughts?
So I guess when you're saying treating pain, because we often talk about that as the end point of a larger process, but you're not talking about the sensations, more the pain as a meaning.
Yeah.
As a sort of meaning.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the perception of pain is dictated by what pain means to us. Like my ankle, for example, I have a friend who's in the circus, he's very good at parkour. I was doing parkour with him, decided to do a jump that he was doing, running up a wall, and we ran off the wall and there was a step that was like about half this, and I landed on the side of the step from a height, straight on the outside of my ankle. And I swelled up immediately and I had bruises from my knee down to the bottom of my foot. It was quite a bad injury. I was in Barcelona at the time and I happened to get food poisoning that same night, so I was trying to limp anyway, and it wasn't pretty. But I had a moment where I was lying in bed, and it was quite soon after the injury had happened. It wasn't actually painful when the injury happened. It was swollen, I felt pressure, not really pain. I was lying there, and in my own internal world, I was going, "You fucking idiot. Why did you do that? You're so stupid. Everyone's going to think you're stupid. Everyone's going to tell you that you were an idiot trying to do that thing with this guy because you know you're, etc." You know, I had this very negative internal chat. And I've done a lot of meditation, so I was aware of my own thought processes inside my head, and I noticed that my ankle started to really ache, throb really badly. And what it meant to me in that moment was that I was an idiot, and that people weren't going to like me anymore. And it started to hurt. I was like, oh, that's fucking weird, okay, strange. So then I asked myself a crucial question. Would you do it again? Yeah, of course I'd do it again. I love jumping up shit. And as soon as I answered that question for myself and I recognized that I would do it again in a heartbeat, the voice that was telling me I was an idiot had no grounds to stand on anymore. And it went away. And it changed back into a sensation of pressure, a sensation of swelling, but it wasn't actually pain. It really screamed at me if I loaded it wrong, don't get me wrong, right? Like the nociceptor system was doing its best to protect me from overloading those damaged tissues. As long as I kept it in a place that wasn't overloading the damaged tissues and I taped it up, It wasn't actually painful. Then I went to get an ultrasound. I was doing well with my rehab. I was proud of myself. I had a chance to prove how my osteopathy works. This is great. Went into the ultrasound scanner. Hey, can I see the ultrasound image while you're doing the ultrasound? Yeah, of course. Okay, great. So, oh, that's interesting. Weird. Don't seem to have any ligaments there. Oh, shit. Yeah, I don't have ligaments there either. Oh, for fuck's sake. And I walked into that ultrasound session feeling pretty good, feeling stable. I was walking on it normally. I walked out of that session feeling like my ankle was flopping around in space and falling off. And it took me a good 2 or 3 months of continually paying attention to what it can functionally do and the direct sensations that were coming back from my ankle, and trying not to think about that image that I had in my head of the ultrasound, for the ankle to start feeling normal again and stable again. Because that had a really, really potent meaning. It meant that my tissues inside were no longer there. And I knew they wouldn't repair because they're completely ruptured. So it contained a lot. And I didn't get them repaired, and now I'm back to jumping around on stuff, and the rehab worked in the end. But my sensations were dictated hugely by what the meaning of them was, not what the actual sensations were that were coming in from my ankle.
If you were talking to yourself now, then what language would you say to yourself to not get yourself down?
I would encourage myself to be curious about my own internal thoughts. So that's interesting, berating yourself for doing this.
Sorry.
I would encourage myself to be curious about my thought processes and be aware of how they were affecting my ankle. And this is what I do with my patients a lot as well, is I promote curiosity about pain. I end up playing with pain a lot. If you go that way, does it hurt? Yeah. How about if we try it again? Does it hurt still? Yeah. Yeah, that was funny, wasn't it? Okay, great. Now if we go the other way, does it hurt? No, not so much. So if you have that kind of fundamental curiosity about those sensations, then you start to have an approach relationship with it and you can learn from them. But if you've got the fear, then that generally creates avoidance and there's little learning that takes
There
place.
wasn't a specific way for that, the practitioner sort of said that in a different way, because you already had that meaning connected to having ligaments. So I guess it's not a simple route.
No, you're right.
So it's not like they could have phrased it differently.
So,
or maybe you warned you that I don't know. If there's a way, basically thinking if there's a way to mitigate that from happening. Maybe we played with that.
I think the way in which I think it's important, because sometimes you can't mitigate these things. But I think it's important to recognize how we update what we understand about the world, and we use sense data to do that, and present moment sense data to do that. So we need to teach people the skill of being able to pay attention to what's actually happening in their bodies, rather than paying attention to what that means to them. So wander back down that spiral and come back into the direct sense data, rather than being engaged with what that means and how scared it is.
And so again, and then on that, if the direct sense data is, for example, just thinking of one specific lady I have who just goes, pain, like when she even just thinks about it.
Yeah.
And that's her immediate response.
Yeah.
How can you start
Okay,
taking her away from
that's a good question. So if it's just pain, and even when they think about it becoming painful,
like even if she starts crying
yeah.
and she's not making that.
So then your fundamental orientation is listening.
Okay.
Just listening to their experience. Because in the act of listening to their experience and really attempting and making it a hard leap to make, but you attempt to understand how they perceive the world and empathize with their world, then you validate their experiences.
Because when she's distracted, she doesn't have that response.
Yeah.
But then I'm just trying to think of how I can.
But if she feels validated, then she'll trust you.
Okay.
And if she trusts you, then she'll listen to you and you can start to update it. But you need to establish that relationship first, otherwise it's not going to happen.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Would this work also with people that have like, I don't know, rheumatoid arthritis or?
Yeah. Yeah, because the beautiful thing about this, and we didn't cover it enough today because I saw we were kind of running out of brain space and time, is that the nociceptive system is not a one-way system, it's a two-way system. It's a two-way system that directly regulates inflammatory processes in the periphery. So the nociceptors and the interoceptors are releasing substance P and CGRP to promote inflammatory processes. So if we are in a state of fear, if we're in a state of like emotional upset, a lot of stress is going on, then we're more likely to trigger an inflammatory response in the periphery via our own nervous systems. So if we're working with people with rheumatoid arthritis, we're working with people with inflammatory joint diseases, if we teach them how to regulate their nervous systems first by breathing, and also to pay attention to these parts of the body in a way that's kind, in a way that is gentle movements, in a way that reduces the input from the nociceptors, we can reduce inflammation directly via the nervous system. So it's very effective for people with chronic inflammatory diseases.
I really like the distinct link between perception and generally physical, like what if you can actually be emotionally in a state of fear or threat, and you have a cut or a bruise, and it's only made worse, and your hand can actually feel bad, so worse based on how you're feeling to another person.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. If you sit back right now and close your eyes and imagine the last time you were really stressed out, your whole sympathetic nervous system will get engaged. Your muscular system will contract. You will have a total body response secondary to that imagined scenario. There is never a separation between what we go on in perception and the physical response. It's always responding immediately to what we're perceiving, because they're folded together.
But you can actually get to the point where there are symptoms rather than feelings, like you can actually present with symptoms.
Definitely, yeah. And the interoceptive system and the nociceptive system directly regulate the immune system, the inflammatory response. So if you're in a state of fear all the time, like what's the function of the inflammatory response? Protection and healing. Mm-hmm. It's trying to protect us, it's non-specific, so it's a generalized protective system. What's the function of fear? Protection and anticipation of threat. So if you're in that state of fear, the whole system is attempting to protect you. Your muscular system is changing, your inflammatory response is increasing, your muscles are contracting, your breathing is changing, your sympathetics are activated, your senses change, you're opening your pupils, you're dilating your auditory, your exteroceptors. This is an entire physical state change, not just a feeling. And as soon as we recognize that, then we can recognize that we can regulate our whole physical state by changing how we feel, changing our emotional state. Joy is associated with a reduction in inflammatory response directly and immediately. Which is kind of cool, right?
And how far would you say that this goes after the recovery process that someone may have?
Well, stress can slow healing rate by up to 60%. Yeah. So a long way. A really, really long way. Okay, yeah.
So if you say joy is related to immune responses, like I'm wondering if, let's say, you talk about something with a patient that makes them brings joy, and makes them passion, mountains, talk about that.
Yeah.
Rather than focusing them in their pain.
Yeah.
What would be more effective?
So that's going to be a really, I highly recommend either doing it with a colleague or doing it with your patient, palpating the traps, the scalenes, the abdominal muscles. These tend to react first with stress responses, and getting them to imagine a joyful place for them, paradise. And when they're there, I guarantee that you'll feel response both in their pulse rate change and their muscle tension change. And they'll likely feel more relaxed in their entire body. And if you get them to notice that by using that question, what do you feel? Then they start to make the connection for themselves. They're shit, if I imagine joy, then I relax, my pain goes away. Then they need to practice joy. So it's a nice intervention.
What? That was pretty much
Yes. In patients where there's quite a specific question, that they might have conditions where they are like OCD, ADHD, would you kind of maybe veer away from this approach because they already are so aware, like it's not healthy awareness, they obsess to the point. I'm talking more about OCD, they obsess about their body.
In the case of OCD and ADHD, I'm not an expert, but I know that ADHD is associated with an increase in checking in for threats in your peripheral environment. So you're constantly checking in on the environment, making sure that you're safe. So you don't have that ability to check in very much or pay attention for an extended period of time. And it's associated with a continuous state of sympathetic arousal. So I would start with teaching people how to regulate their nervous systems using breathing. So spend a long time teaching people how to get into a state of safety, parasympathetic, relaxed state. And you find that often that then calms down their ability to, or their need to check in on everything else, and they're able to relax a little bit deeper. And then you can start to work. But it's hard. But what this means is that we have scope to kind of do those things. We have scope to start to intervene in these kind of conditions. With the help of a psychologist, we can start to work really, really well together because we can teach people about their bodies. And their bodies are the master regulator. It dictates a lot of their mental states and processes.
We'll pick a bit off topic, but you said depression is an overactivation of the parasympathetic. I always thought it was the other way around. I mean, you have sort of inflammation, cortisol, all these things that are associated with the sympathetic.
No, I mean, yes, you have an increase in cortisol. Yes, you have an increase in classical stress hormones, but the nervous system is shifted into shutdown. So shutdown is a parasympathetic overactivation. It's designed to lower blood pressure, to conserve resources when a threat is overwhelming. And you notice an increase in parasympathetics plus an increase in cortisol because it's not a relaxed parasympathetic state, it's chilled and you're like, happy. It's a parasympathetic state of overwhelmed shutdown. Does that make sense? Yeah. And sympathetic and parasympathetic systems are not on and off. So they don't just have a global effect when you activate your parasympathetics. They're organ specific. So you can have differential effects of sympathetics and parasympathetics going on at the same time.
Is it one or the other?
You're getting to the limits of my knowledge of depression and physiology. I'm not a psychologist, but that's what I understand from reading Stephen Porges' work on the polyvagal theory, and he describes depression as a shutdown response. So if you want to look it up, Stephen Porges, the polyvagal theory, and he talks about those kind of different parasympathetic sympathetic states.
And how would you apply all of this to like someone with autism?
With autism?
Yeah.
Well, with autism, you notice a real disruption in their interoceptive ability and therefore their empathy. So there's some really good research papers on using these C-tactile fibers in autistic patients who can tolerate touch, and it starts to give them a sense of self and then a sense of empathy because you're starting to create plastic change in the insula connected to their attentional processes. So there is good evidence for improving interoceptive awareness and improving functionality in autistic patients.
Yeah, with that, how can you improve as well?
Yeah. Okay, so I think we should wrap up. I really appreciate all your questions. Very astute.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll get upset if I have to leave the BCNO.
Oh well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. I'll see a few of you in March. We'll be going through much more of this stuff, much more detail, and much more practical application.
When is the next one?
March, come to this.
Right next to the hospital. Oh, yeah.
Sorry?
The week before the hospital.
Is it? Okay. Well, it'll run again. So I'll try and organise it for another period.
I've got a little present for you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Lovely.
It's a really cool charity. Check them out, and they're really nice chocolates, and they're all gold and everything. So thank you so much for it. I think you could hear like our hushing in the corner. And just, why has no one said it in this paper? And it kind of really hits the nail on the head in terms of what we heard last week and bringing it into something like this. Absolutely. I think it was a really interesting thing that clicked for me at the end there was treating pain. Because we say, don't treat the pain, that's the consequence of the, but it's seeing pain as a way of making meaning of what's happened and not as like a physical cause. Yeah, anyway, I don't think that's
No, can I just ask you, quickly after recording as well?
Yeah. So you guys are in the Teams meeting, so it will be automatically recorded as well.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not really good at that.
I'll send it to you guys, and I'll also send it to you, Joshua.
Hang up on
Yeah, you can
Teams.
finish the meeting.
See you later, everybody.
What about the slides?